You're listening to The Conversation Weekly from The Conversation. It's autumn 1924, and in a university classroom in Johannesburg, South Africa, an Australian-born anatomist called Raymond Dart is about to start class when he's approached by one of his students.
One of Dart's students, Josephine Salmons, brought an ancient baboon fossil from Taung into class one day. And that fossil was blasted out of a lime mine.
This is Christa Kuljian, a science historian and a research associate at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa.
And when Dart saw the baboon fossil, he discussed it with a fellow geologist at Wits, Robert Young, and they agreed that there might be more interesting fossils in Taung.
Taung is a mining town in the northwest province of South Africa, about 250 miles southwest of Johannesburg.
So Young headed to Taung soon after that, and people on site had also seen that there was, fossils of potential interest there. He chose several promising pieces of rock that had been blasted out of the mine. Those kinds of rocks are called breccia. Rock that has fossils embedded in it. And he carried them back to Johannesburg and gave them to Dart.
One of these pieces of rock would turn out to change the way we think about the origins of humanity. It contained a fossil that became known as the Taung skull.
When Dart looked at the rock that held the Taung skull, he knew right away that it wasn't a baboon fossil, but something very different. And he spent a great amount of time using his wife's knitting needles, actually, to chip away at the rock. And when he was able to have that surrounding rock fall away and to look at this fossil and what he believed to be ancient pre-human fossil that was showing an intermediate type between ape and man, as he described it, he wrote up an article for the journal Nature, and it very quickly was published in February 1925.
Dart described this skull as Australopithecus africanus, and the publication of that description in Nature in 1925 is now regarded as the beginning of the discipline of paleoanthropology.
The Taung skull made a fundamental contribution to paleoanthropology and the understanding of human evolution. And the fossil is a powerful reminder that all humans on Earth share common origins in Africa and a common humanity.
In this episode, 100 years since the discovery of the Taung skull, we'll hear from Christa about Raymond Dart's complicated legacy. We'll also speak to South African paleoanthropologist Dipuo Kgotleng about what's happened to the city of Taung itself and how paleoanthropology has changed over the last century. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Joining me today is Natasha Joseph, science editor at The Conversation in Africa, based in Cape Town. Tash, great to have you back on the show.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me again.
So we've just heard the story of how the Taung skull, which is estimated at around 2.5 million years old, wound up in the possession of a man called Raymond Dart in the 1920s. How has the anniversary of that discovery been marked then in South Africa?
So the South African Journal of Science published a special issue that they released on the 7th of February to mark the centenary of Dart's original paper. And they brought together a group of African researchers and some international collaborators, some of whom are from different countries on the continent and are now working elsewhere in the world. And they contributed papers that offer perspectives on the history and legacy of the discipline, and then also the science, what's actually being done at base level with these remains, trying to understand all sorts of questions of who we are and where we come from. So there's a range of really interesting papers, some of them that sort of frame the bigger question, right? So what does it mean to be 100 years on from this really important discovery? And it is very much, I think, in the context of what's been a big conversation in South Africa and certainly in the UK as well since 2015 with the student protests that started in South Africa is the idea of decolonization. And so what are the implications of this lone white male colonizer, right? Australian, Brit, who then came over to South Africa, working with ancestral remains and in spaces that are the home of Indigenous Black South Africans. What does that take us into the work of paleoanthropologists with more recent human remains? And there are, of course, all sorts of considerations around what's culturally appropriate for dealing with human remains. In certain cultures, remains are sacred. You wouldn't handle them. And there's been very little interaction between those communities and then more westernized science. And so what's happening now, and the centenary provided these scholars with a really good lens to do that through, is reckoning with what paleoanthropology will look like in the next century, now that the discipline is starting to grapple with the role of African scientists, with the role of the continent, and also how do we reckon with that kind of lone explorer myth and start to recognize that there's so much more to all disciplines of science than just one person doing brilliant work.
And we've been talking to two researchers who've contributed papers to this centenary edition, Christa Kuljian and Dipuo Kgotleng. Can you tell us a bit about both of them?
So Christa's a research associate at the University of the Witwatersrand Institute for Social and Economic Research in South Africa. She's also a freelance author, and she wrote a book called Darwin's Hunch about Charles Darwin's theory that Africa was the cradle of humanity. And she's taken a really critical look in that and her other work at the aftermath and the legacy of these white men in this discussion around our human origins and how you disentangle their scientific genius and the fact that they did make incredible discoveries and come up with theories that were borne out with all of the complicated kind of racial and colonial politics that were at play. And then I know you also spoke with Dipuo Kgotleng, who's the director of the Paleo Research Institute at the University of Johannesburg here in South Africa. And she reflected on 100 years of paleo research and how do we, looking forward, make it relevant in discussions about transforming South Africa and contributing towards social cohesion in the next century.
Great, and we're going to hear a bit more from them now. So thank you, Tash, for giving us some context to those conversations.
Thanks for having me.
While the discovery of the Taung child's skull is being hailed as a great achievement today, at the time it wasn't recognised as such. Here's Christa Kuljian again.
In the late 1800s and early 1900s, paleoanthropology was a fledgling field. And just to provide some context, in 1871, Charles Darwin published The Descent of Man. And he wrote that he thought it was likely that all humans had common origins in Africa. So Darwin's hunch. But his theory was not widely accepted at the time. Scientists argued that humans had evolved in Europe or perhaps Asia. And that belief was influenced by the false assumption that many scientists had that Europeans were superior to other people from around the world and that there was a hierarchy of race. So paleoanthropology and the search for human origins had its roots in that era of racialized thinking and white supremacy.
As scientists at the turn of the 20th century began searching for fossil evidence of human evolution, they found Neanderthal fossils in Germany, Belgium, and France. Others were looking in Asia, but no one took Darwin's hunch seriously, so there were no archaeologists looking for early humans or pre-humans in Africa.
In 1912, a fossil find was announced in Britain. It was called Piltdown Man, which had a large ape-like cranium and a more human-like mandible. And there was great national pride. Archaeologists and anatomists concluded that humans had their origins in Sussex, England. But more than 40 years later, in 1953, Piltdown man was found to be a hoax, and it wasn't an ancient fossil at all.
Still, in the early 20th century, this Piltdown man was hugely influential, even for some of Raymond Dart's own mentors. So in 1925, when Dart published his article about the Taung skull, a pre-human fossil found in Africa, most of his peers were skeptical.
They couldn't imagine that Africa played a role in human evolution. And it would take another 25 years into the late 1940s before the international scientific community would start to take the Taung skull seriously. And that was as a result of further evidence and fossil finds in Africa.
Scientists were also reluctant to accept that the skull's relatively small cranium could belong to a pre-human.
The thought at the time was that humans had evolved because their brains had become larger first. And so they were expecting, even though it was a child, for it to have a larger cranium. And so what Dart was saying was that he thought that even though there was a smaller brain case, that perhaps humans had evolved first as being bipedal, because he concluded by looking at the skull and its formation that the Taung child had been bipedal.
Now, though Dart was ahead of his time when it came to this theory of evolution, in other important ways he was still very much a product of it.
In the 1920s, scientists across Europe and Britain and the US who were interested in human origins, including Dart, were not only collecting ancient fossils, they were also collecting human skeletons. And scientists thought that humans could be divided into separate and distinct racial types based on physical characteristics. And they thought that these pure racial types, which we now know do not exist, would give them a clue to understanding human evolution. So as a result, scientists, including Dart, established human skeleton collections. They were involved in a number of disturbing and racist practices. They were invasive in measuring the physical features of living people, including their genitals. And they often used unethical practices to build human skeleton collections, including trading in human remains. And this was happening in universities across Europe and the UK. It was happening at the Smithsonian Institute in the United States. It was widespread. So Raymond Dart really brought a number of these disturbing anthropological practices into the 20th century. And he passed his belief in race typology on to many of his students, who also, went on in this vein of research, and which is part of a legacy of scientific racism in the fields of anatomy, physical anthropology, and paleoanthropology. And Dart and some of his colleagues, in the 20s and 30s and 40s, believed that it wasn't only physical types, but also cultural development that was shaped by a racial hierarchy. So he supported the theory of cultural diffusion, and he attributed all social and cultural progress in Africa to external influences from elsewhere in the world. So I think it's important that we see scientists not only as heroes, but as human beings whose assumptions are often influenced by many factors, often social and political. And critical reflection on Dart's legacy began in the 1990s, in the post-apartheid era, and has continued since. But many paleoanthropologists would like to celebrate Dart as having described the Taung skull and are quite hesitant to bring up his difficult legacy. And I think it's important to do both. We can hold up Dart's fundamental contribution to paleoanthropology, the description of the Taung skull and the recognition of Africa's place in understanding human origins, and at the same time, acknowledge and recognize and discuss his legacy of scientific racism.
When Gareth was 14, he was in a relationship with an attractive young teacher at his school, and he thought he was the luckiest boy in the world. But when she walked out of his life, everything started to unravel. 35 years later, everyone's acting like it never happened, and Gareth wants to understand why.
How about the truth? How about we do that first and then we work out where we're going to go from there? How about the truth?
This new 4-part series is about who gets to be a perpetrator and a victim. To listen, just search for Lucky Boy wherever you get your podcasts.
We've been hearing about the complicated legacy of Raymond Dart, who spent the rest of his career after his discovery of the Taung skull living in South Africa. And he was living there during a period of white minority rule called apartheid. Under South Africa's racist apartheid government, the theory of evolution clashed with the creationist religious beliefs of those in power. So from 1948 to 1994, paleoanthropology was largely sidelined, and evolution was not taught in schools in the very country that was home to one of the world's most significant fossil hominid sites. Once apartheid ended in 1994, though, that changed, and South Africa's new government under Nelson Mandela began funding paleoanthropology research. A few years later, in the year 2000, a young South African student called Dipuo Kgotleng found herself at a careers fair at Wits University and happened to see the archaeology stall.
The people there didn't look interesting, but the material that they had was quite intriguing. So I went to that stall and then I started reading through what archaeology was. And I was hooked from that day on. And I immediately registered for archaeology, and I've been in the discipline ever since.
Dipuo is currently director of the Paleo Research Institute at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. But when she first graduated with her master's in archaeology back in the early 2000s, she left academia for a couple of years to work as an archaeologist for the South African government in Taung.
In 2005, the Taung skull was inscripted into World Heritage List. And they needed to start developing the site into a proper World Heritage site with a developing management authority that can develop it as a tourist center. And I was the first person to be employed as the archaeologist. My role there was engagement with the public, because really there is not much engagement that has happened between the scientists and the public of Taung. So the bulk of it involved public engagement, government and stakeholder engagement. So we're working a lot on engaging the government into developing this discipline as a priority in Taung itself.
Dipuo told me that in many ways, Taung in 2005 wasn't all that different from Taung in 1924, when the child's skull was discovered.
Taung is located in a very rural area, and not much has changed, to be honest, between then and now. There is still a lot of poverty. The infrastructure is not developed. It looks like it's still stuck in time. When you go there, it genuinely looks like it's still stuck in the 1920s. While there are some developments that are going on, really it's nothing to write home about.
The lime mines at Taung have long been shut down since the gold and diamond mining industries in South Africa began to decline. The buildings in which the mine operators lived and worked are still standing, but they're quite dilapidated. These buildings are now used as environmental and education centres for local school children, and plans for a museum on the site are slowly taking shape. But beyond the lack of local economic development, Dipuo says there's also a lack of knowledge among local people about the celebrated archaeological find that put their town on the map.
The knowledge about the science has not actually filtrated through to the locals. I mean, such an important discovery that actually propelled a lot of what we know today as paleoanthropology. So you ask locals about what they know about the skull. They just know that there was a skull. They cannot articulate what the skull is or what it means, or even most of them have never even seen what it looks like, unfortunately. I mean, right now, human evolution is part of the life sciences curriculum in South Africa. So a few of the students, of the young children who are going through the life sciences stream might have had interaction with education about the skull. But locally, especially in a highly illiterate part of the country, because the literacy levels are quite low in that region, a lot of the people still are not aware of what it is, let alone the significance of the skull.
This lack of knowledge in Taung is part of the enduring legacy of the apartheid creationist science curriculum. But Dipuo believes it's also the result of colonialism in the field of archaeology itself. The story of the Taung child tends to focus on Raymond Dart, which paints a picture of archaeology as a discipline of lone white men, think Indiana Jones, who come to a rural area, usually in the global south, extract a fossil or artifact of historical and cultural value, and are then celebrated around the world for their discovery.
So if you start from the 1920s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the prominent figures, who are they? White males, Western people who are coming into the country to study the discipline. And a lot of them were anatomists at the time. Raymond Dart was an anatomist. And they trained other young white male anatomists. And that trend continued right through towards the end of apartheid. There are no prominent non-white male figures, but the trend started to change when we're seeing some white women coming to the fore, practicing as well, becoming anthropologists. And we're talking about South Africans specifically. There was a lot of effort to recruit Africans from outside of South Africa, but post-1994, we were some of the early groups that came in. And I don't want to say nothing is changing. Things are changing. Post-1994, we are seeing a number of indigenous, local South Africans participating in the discipline.
And part of what you argue is that discoveries like this are often told through the lens or through the story of like one hero, but it's actually a team of people, isn't it, behind these discoveries?
Yeah, to be able to analyze this fossil wealth that we get from our country, you need a team to be able to decipher the meaning. You need a geologist, you need an anatomist, you need somebody with specialization in osteology. So if you look at the trend these days, it is quite impossible to have one individual be able to fully analyze even just one specimen. So what this field has done in the past is to highlight these prominent figures, but there's a lot of hidden figures that actually participated in that discovery. For a scientist to have that fossil in hand, there was somebody who was on the ground assisting with that excavation. There were other laborers who were there, who are, in most cases, that they never get recognized. So that is what we were arguing against, that we need to recognize all the workers in that whole process of the discovery through to publication.
Dipuo believes that focusing on the whole team is what will allow South Africans to take ownership of their own legacy in the discipline of paleoanthropology.
The public does not see the hidden figures. The public does not see who was supporting this research. So it really removes itself from the public. In South Africa, paleoanthropology is far removed. Even in 2025 today, last week I was teaching some of our new students, and a lot of them had not heard of these discoveries. If it has not appeared on TV, they know nothing, absolutely nothing about those. If you have a legacy of showing people who are outsiders coming in and presenting this, it immediately creates a distance between the locals and the discipline, because they see this as, oh, this is the white man's discipline. I know myself when I told people that I studied archaeology, I remember a friend of mine asking me, what are you going to do with white men in caves? Because that's the impression that it creates, that this is a discipline for white men in caves. So we need to have locals fully participating so that the locals can see this as part of themselves and take ownership and identify with the discipline, because it really, the legacy that has happened over the past is that it has continued to mystify the discipline to the locals. Africans don't identify with evolution or paleoanthropology, archaeology. Even in 2025, it's still the case, unfortunately.
Is paleoanthropology inherently a political science, do you think?
So during training, one thing that we get taught is that this is a scientific enterprise. It is not influenced by politics. But in as much as the scientists believe that this is a science, it's a highly politicized science. Right now in South Africa, paleoanthropology is a national priority. Why is it a national priority? Because it reinforces Africa's identity, Africa's contribution. So the point is to create this positive image of Africa and how Africa has contributed to humanity. It plays into South Africa's politics. We're trying to create unity. We're trying to pass on the message that we all are the same, irrespective of what we look like on the outside. But in times when that was not required, and it was against a different government and with different political ideologies, it was removed. So it is impossible to remove it from the social politics of the time. I'm not saying it's inherently political, but it plays into the politics.
Thank you so much, Dipuo.
Thanks, Gemma.
That's it for this week's episode. We'll put a link in our show notes to some of the articles on the conversation that we've been publishing about the anniversary of the discovery of the Taung skull. This episode was written and produced by Katie Flood, with production assistance from Ment Marawani and sound design by Eloise Stevens. Our theme music is by Nita Sal. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor, and I'm Gemma Ware, the executive producer. You can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com, and you can sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com, and please rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. Thanks for listening.